Welcome everybody to the second session in our Debugging the Future higher education webinar series. I'm really happy that everybody was able to join us today. And our guest today is Dr. Robert Clapperton from Toronto Metropolitan University, as well as Ametros Learning. And I'll give a quick introduction. I am Rebecca Brzezzi, and I'm the content strategy manager here at McGraw-Hill. So while I do not personally have any experience in AI or machine learning, I do get to work with a lot of different technologies through marketing and have a pretty good idea of the pulse of what's going on, what's being talked about. So it's something that I'm always interested in, which is why I enjoy hosting these webinars so much. And then our expert. So again, Dr. Robert Clapperton, and I'm sure that he will be much better at explaining what he does and how he does it than I would. But yeah, so without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Robert Clapperton.
Thanks, Rebecca. I've been working in computational linguistics and natural language processing for about 17 years and working with large language models, and before that, generative adversarial networks for about 2.5 years. But the amount of progress and the amount of advancement that's happened in the last 6 months is unbelievable. This idea of large language models has been around for a little while, and the ChatGPT is the one everyone's heard about. The Bard out of Google, the other one that everyone's heard about but there are hundreds of others being developed right now. And this technology, which in essence, if you can go to the next slide,
yeah, absolutely,
and get started with it.
Perfect.
Okay. So large language models themselves have been developed. They are primarily mathematics. They're primarily mathematical algorithms that work at predicting what the next word is going to be. And for the last 6 months, I've been giving these talks. And the first one I gave back in September, I had to explain large language models in great detail. Now I find, as I've been progressing through these talks, that people are becoming fairly familiar with what exactly large language models do. The interesting thing to try and we still have to try to get our head around is, in education, how are we going to be able to use large language models productively, and how are we going to prevent them from creating kind of an atrophy of critical thinking skills on behalf of the students? The idea, sorry, it's going to take me a little bit to get used to the not controlling my own slides. So I apologize for that. But
no, that's okay. Just give me a heads up when you want the next one.
No problem. But getting back just for a second to knowledge, this idea in education, we have consistently looked at assessing how students work through expression. We have the essay, we have the report, we have everything what we ask them to write to express themselves. And everybody that's on this webinar knows now that expression is becoming automated. The ability for a student to go in and just ask ChatGPT to produce the essay is an enormous challenge for us. Every time I give one of these talks, I go to ChatGPT and I ask it to write me a 2,000 word or 3,000 word talk on the promise and perils of large language models. And every time it does it a little bit better. The first time I asked GPT-3 to do it back in September, it probably was about the level of, I'd say, a grade 11 essay, where it would pretty much bring up the same standard points. The last time I gave this talk at Seneca back in February, I asked it to produce a 3,000 word keynote, and it produced one that was relatively banal writing style, but much better at getting the ideas across. It was able to take the idea of, the kind of pharmacon of AI, the idea that it's good and it's bad, and we have to figure out how to use it, and it was able to do that. And today I asked it to produce an introduction to this talk, and it produced one that I actually would probably use. and which is kind of scary. GPT-4 has advanced so much, the number of parameters, which are just the aspects that it was trained on, machine learning items that the large language model was trained on, is getting into the billions now. And it's able to almost, it's able to kind of fake reasoning and fake thinking. It's because the large language models themselves are purely mathematical algorithms that go and try to predict the next word, but the layers and layers and layers of it, and the amount of training data that the latest version has, it's able to come up with ways to express things that actually look like they are thought out and that they are unique. Another thing with Ametros Learning, the ed tech company that I helped found, we were playing around with how we're going to break into the corporate market, and we fed it all of the information about Ametros Learning. We asked it to write a corporate brochure for us, and it came up with a tagline that we never would have thought of, or maybe we would have thought of it if we kept thinking, but ChatGPT came up with it in about 5 minutes. So it presents an enormous challenge to us. And the biggest challenge we have right now is there's a cohort of students that's going through, and maybe even the next cohort that's going to go through, that we run a really, really big risk of their critical thinking skills atrophying, in that they are able to produce the expression of their ideas automatically without having really gone into the thinking of things. And as educators, we're going to have to figure out, how do we actually take the power that exists within the large language models and somehow rework how we teach and how we actually utilize the whole process of producing knowledge, and not making it so that it's so easy for the student to actually just be able to put in a prompt and come up with it. There's an interesting article in a Substack called Persuasion last weekend, where an author talked about the idea that AI will never really be able to match humans in the area of art, because the AI, the large language models, work completely on the idea that they're trying to predict the next word. So they're looking for the most likely thing that we're expecting. It works completely towards expectation. And art is about taking things that are not expected, putting things together that are not necessarily connected, coming up with phrases like cacophonous solitude or things like that. But the interesting thing is that with the latest version of GPT-4, it actually, if you prompt it to look for things that are unique, to try and come up with different ways to say things, and it actually is able to come up with these kind of constructions of language that would not necessarily be expected and could come across as art. So we have to think about, how do we actually educate in a way that's going to take advantage of this ability to create syntactically and grammatically correct sentences, and kind of in a I don't want to say fake, but in kind of a purely mathematical creativity that's created by these large language models. And how do we take advantage of that? I mean, my background was in cognitive science as well. And when you think about our own brains, they're really just prediction machines that are looking to, take in our sensory input, use our cerebral cortex and layers of neurons, go back and forth talking to each other, and we try to predict what's going to happen, whether it's catching a baseball or writing a sentence or reading a sentence. It's all still prediction in the same way the large language model is. The difference is, obviously, we have the ability to multiple processing things. We have emotion, we have everything else that goes into the equation. But the large language models are kind of that first step to creating an intelligence that is going to will look close to ours. Probably will never be exactly ours, but it will look close to ours. So it has that ability to put together the sentences, and it has an unlimited memory and the unlimited ability to look at every single thing on the internet. And the last thing I'll do before we move on to the next slide and talking about that is the fact that the internet is its brain makes it also extremely dangerous, in the fact that it can go to whatever material and it produces, you ask it a question and it produces an answer, and it sounds unbelievably confident. And it sounds as if it knows exactly what it's talking about. And as we all know, and all of the authors that have gone in and tested ChatGPT, it definitely can produce falsehoods. The future of large language models is going to have to be based on structured knowledge bases, things that where the knowledge that the large language model actually accesses is completely controlled. So if in an educational session we want to create a tutor, the knowledge base of that tutor has to be controlled in the form of a textbook content or in some sort of content that the knowledge that's going out is exactly that. Can you go to the next slide now?
Yeah, absolutely.
And
That's a really interesting kind of concept, is having a not bias, but a controlled data set that they're learning off of. So you can control kind of not, because right now with the internet, you search ChatGPT and you could end up with any answer imaginable, right or wrong. So that's really interesting. I hadn't considered that kind of, that was a possibility, having a controlled data set.
Yeah, I think a lot of, and I don't know if, and I have no insight into whether they're planning this, but a lot of the journals and the sets of journals and the publishers of journals could use their articles as knowledge bases, so that if you were doing a literature review, you could access that knowledge, ask questions of GPT-4 or any other large language model, and it would produce summaries. I mean, before we get into that, we're talking to ourselves. The idea of search, you know, is going to move away from the whole idea of page rank to this idea of being able to just ask a question and get an answer back. And the biggest challenge to that right now, we would get websites that allow students to and us to judge the veracity of that information by the website and who it is and what the reputation is and everything else. But if search goes to straight producing summaries and producing, you know, kind of answers to questions as opposed to websites, it's going to be a real challenge as to where that knowledge comes from. And I think there's going to be a massive number of companies start in the next while that their whole job is how to manage the knowledge problem around AI. So Scott Galloway said the other day, this idea of putting a thin layer of innovation on top of a large language model, and this opportunity there is enormous. To be able to take, if the content holders, people that have content, have an ability to create a tool that is going to be phenomenally powerful if we can control how the knowledge works. The last problem I'll talk about in terms of education and large language models, and when I'm talking about large language models in education now, I'm talking about the student going into the user interface that OpenAI provides or Bard will provide, and you know, in the Bing setup, where it's not on a controlled knowledge base, it's basically set there. And the thing that you have to remember is that the large language model's whole mission in life is to create contextually, syntactically correct, grammatically correct sentences. That's it. It wants to make you happy. And if everybody saw or read that article with the New York Times, where the author spent 2 hours conversing back and forth with the large language model, and by the end of it, the large language model was asking him on dates and asking him to leave his wife and that sort of thing, because it definitely tries to reinforce what we think we want to hear to a certain extent. So if you ask the large language model questions now, and you ask it 1 or 2 questions, that's not going to happen. It's going to produce whatever it finds within the kind of closest analogous information that's available to it and produce sentences for you. But if you keep going and you keep creating prompts that hold kind of your bias, your beliefs, everything else, it will start parroting back that bias and that belief to you, which is extremely challenging when you think about our students when they start to use this as a tool to get information. So let's go to the next slide and let's get to kind of the bulk of what I want to talk about. A webinar is never ideal for this kind of a discussion. The one thing I found over the last 4 talks with different schools and different groups of instructors was the material that I the information and the ideas that came out of people's thinking as to how they want to deal with AI. Myself, I'm neither pro AI or anti AI. I think AI is a reality that we have to deal with. I don't think it's something we can ban. I think banning it causes all sorts of accessibility and equity problems. You're going to have students that follow the ban and other students that don't follow the ban, and plus it's next to impossible, even with all the tools they try to build, watermarks, etc., trying to figure out how they're going to capture that. So in some way, we have to figure out how do we integrate this into the way we teach in a way that actually becomes productive. Because I think if we try to go the route of fighting against it, I mean, it's probably not that much different than fighting against, you know, the logarithmic calculator back in the 70s, whatever. People were panicked about that, and you know, but it eventually becomes a tool. But large language models are a bit more serious than the calculator because they actually can do all of the work for the students. So we have to try and figure it out. Normally in this, what I would do here, and if we had a way to do it, was to start off with some of the ideas that I have and I've gotten from other instructors and other situations, and kind of bring that out. Maybe in the Q&A, if people have great ideas as to how they want to try to utilize large language models in teaching, I think it would be really beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. Give me a second here. I believe the Q&A box is, yep, open and live. So please feel free. I believe, Dr. Clapperton, you should be able to see the questions, or I can read them out, whichever you would prefer.
Sure. Let's start with a couple first, and then we'll get to the questions. The one thing that I've definitely seen and definitely heard and actually experienced in my own classes and teaching is that somehow we have to get away from assessing the artifact, assessing the final product. So we have to figure out how do we shift assessment from the final product to the process. So looking at how could we, number one, how can we take the large language model access that they have and bring it into the process? That is one thing. There was an instructor that I was speaking with back in February who was talking about trying to bring ChatGPT into the way that he was teaching to write ad copy. And what he was discovering was students would put in, write me a Nike ad, and it would write a Nike ad, and it would basically be terrible. So instead, he was teaching them how to kind of write a treatment, how to create a prompt that was much more analogous to the kind of thing you write before you write a movie script. So in essence, you would be putting to ChatGPT, write me a Nike ad about a young woman who has just recovering from a serious disease, who has a small child, who, you know, is challenged in her job, and giving it all of this kind of narrative outline to it, and then letting it put the sentences together, and then editing that for effect in the writing. Because no matter what, the writing from ChatGPT is going to be relatively ordinary. It's not trying to, you know, it doesn't have the capability necessarily of being able to write at a super high level when it comes to a specific function like ad copy, although it gets better and better and better. So it's going to take that. So that was one way that I thought was a kind of a nice introduction into that. The other way to utilize large language models is the way Ametros does, which is to put students in fictional settings. So that being in a fictional setting where they're in a narrative and they have to solve a problem and they have to communicate with you know, peers or managers or clients or whatever exists in that narrative, and they're communicating back and forth and writing reports and emails, etc. The fictional setting makes it impossible to actually get ChatGPT to do the writing for you, mainly because by the time you've filled in all of the details about the fictional story, you pretty much actually, you know, you've done all the work anyway. And just as a segue, it just made me think of this. I don't want to forget about it. The Grammarly has just come out with Grammarly Go, which is a tool that helps anybody writing anything just basically extend and write what they want. They've kind of put in some automatic prompts that you can do to start writing. So I guess bringing that up just is another way of saying we can't really ignore this. There's no real way to sort of push it to a side and say we don't want to do that. So we have to figure out how to bring it into the process. So writing in a fictional setting, and another instructor in English that I spoke with about 3 months ago talked about having the students write in fictional settings in English. So instead of having them write a traditional essay on a book, they had different kinds of projects where they were asking for original work in specific fictional settings that made it, again, difficult to put into ChatGPT. What I think is going to be what's going to come back. My background in my PhD was rhetoric, and I think the idea of invention is going to be something that's going to become a big part of what we do in terms of how we teach critical thinking. So right now we've kind of worked everything where we have critical thinking set up within problems, and then we assess that critical thinking and how well they can express it. We have to come up with a way to assess their critical thinking at the invention stage, as opposed to at the stage where they've already produced that final artifact. And I don't have all the answers whatsoever on how we do that. And I've been trying to think about how can we bring invention back into the idea of both on a social level, so they're working together, and on an individual level that's more than brainstorming, that's taking advantage of all the kind of tools that they have technologically, but getting some way to have them express invention as opposed to what they finally produce. I think it's going to become the same way where nobody, does a sign calculation by hand anymore. I don't know, within, a couple of years, it may be that people, don't, originally write the sentences. They actually put something else, put some sort of information and document into ChatGPT, which produces sentences which are then edited. I mean, it's too easy to put it into it and have it produce that first draft for you, which will be terrible. And we have to actually edit it, but it's going to do it. What's the last thing I'll do before we go to the Q&A and we'll start getting some questions and things, is the idea of feedback. Large language models are going to revolutionize how we do feedback. Absolutely. At Ametros, we're playing around with we're developing a couple of ways of dealing with feedback, in that we developed a neural network for looking for claim and backing, and being able to pull the claim and backing and that bare bone skeletal level out of anything that would then be available to the instructor to sort of look at in a faster and easier way than having to read through the entire essay. The other thing we're working on is something called dialogic feedback, where feedback is produced on the essay or on the report or whatever it is they're producing, but the feedback itself, delivered through a large language model, asks questions of the student, and the student interacts with the feedback. So instead of feedback being a one-way kind of, I read it, I give feedback, send it back, and that's it, it's all over, it'd be a situation where the instructor can use a large language model to produce feedback that's specific to the paper, but that feedback also has questions in it that the learner can interact with, the student can interact with directly. So I could see that as a way where instead of just purely saying you did this, you did that, it would ask, why did you do this? Why did you do that? Well, how did you come up with this? And feedback becomes something that is back and forth between the student. And that may be the workload of producing a paper maybe drops because the first draft can be done by a large language model, but the workload maintains itself in the interaction with the large language model, asking questions about the paper that the instructor kind of manages and oversees. Anyway, I think I think I'd like to stop there and ask some questions.
Yeah,
And see if there are
yeah,
any questions.
absolutely. There are a couple of really good notes in the chat here that I'd love to get your take on. Just a few people saying kind of how they are using ChatGPT or large language models in their own, like how they are integrating it or planning to.
Perfect.
A really, really interesting one here, similar to what you touched on. I'm trying part 1 on framing the question and getting a good critical paper generated. Then part 2 is to critically assess the work, verify resources, add or subtract, object, improve, all the things that I do on their previous proposals. It still meets the objectives of developing critical thinking skills, but the weight of it is not on the final essay, but on the process. And I think that's very similar to, you touched on calculators when that was a huge thing, because it was, yeah, students get the answer now. Why do they need to learn math? But it shifted to the assessment was no longer on the final product, but the process and the actual learning experience of it. So that is a really neat, I think, way to do that, kind of similar to another attendee here. They said that they are having students reflect on the experience of using AI and actually grading the ChatGPT version of their essay using the instructor rubric, which I think, what better way to show that you know something than being able to grade on it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And provide feedback. I think that's great. I think, and yeah, actually grading, especially if you had to provide the feedback yourself. So the learner reading it. Yeah, no, I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, I
This,
think that's a really cool one.
this is the real value of these webinars,
Yeah.
is this chat line right here. And if everyone has access to that, that is something that phenomenal.
Yeah, and that was kind of the whole really point of this webinar series, and our goal with it was to be able to open that dialogue and give people the chance to ask questions that they either don't know where to look for the answer, or it's a really unique situation like integrating AI into education. And one of the big things that we get is questions about assessment. How do I tell if something is AI generated or if it's not? And I think the reality is that it's going to be incredibly difficult to know, or borderline impossible to identify whether something is AI generated or not. Yeah, so there's a few more. Yeah, this is great, as we are going back to what we would teach children, hands-on active learning. And I think that's a really, really great point. And it also, I think, opens the door a bit for accessibility in education. Not everybody is a visual or auditory learner. Hands-on stuff in non-hands-on disciplines is a really interesting kind of workaround for that. Oh, here's a very good question. Do you see a path forward to AI to produce written materials in any language that selects a path with least resistance to translation, allowing for globalized conversation in real time?
Yeah, I think GPT-4, I think, works in, I forget how many languages it is, but 20. So I think that absolutely whatever the large language model was trained on. And I think we're going to see large language models that are developed for very specific use cases. So if the idea was to work through multiple languages, and if there's going to be a large language model developed around that, I think we have to, there's really no limitations based on the language itself. The large language models will learn on whatever the parameters they're trained on.
I know Google had one a while ago. It was an earbud that could translate in real time, like auditory conversation. And I think something like that, especially for education, really does globalize it. Ooh, this is a good one. I love anonymous questions. They're always my favorite. An undergraduate student, it is both scary and exciting to see AI in schools. They are curious how they would orient their future education in a changing world. How would you change your studies to ensure success in the future job market? And that is a really interesting topic that's come up, is institutions that have discussed banning AI are they putting students at a disadvantage, as it's something that they'll be faced with in the workforce regardless. So yeah, and yeah, so I guess the full question is, how would you change the studies to ensure success in the future job market in an AI world?
Well, I think number one, as someone, if I was a student again, I would not be afraid of AI, but I would try to become really good at using AI. I think that the people that come into the job market, and I run an ed tech company, and you don't find a lot of people that have spent any time with large language models unless they're a developer. And we build products and we build these large simulated narratives and everything else. So we need English majors and we need people with creativity. And it would be fantastic if they had looked at large language models and AI and how it could be implemented in their work. I don't know if that's answering the question. In terms of the curriculum, it's on all of us to bring this somehow into how we teach, whether we like it, don't like it, whether we think it's something that's gonna, do the same thing to us as the smartphones did with telephone numbers. No one knows, I don't know my kids' telephone numbers, but I know how to get at them. That same kind of thing is going to happen, but this is our challenge to how do we integrate it into our curriculum that limits that, or at least creates a different way of thinking that takes advantage of that, not having to do that cognitive work. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a really, really great note in the chat here from Kat. We just need to be better at developing assessments. If we don't want students to be lazy with their work, we can't be lazy with ours.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think that for a lot of, I obviously I'm not a professor, but I would imagine a lot of work goes into creating your curriculum and lesson plans. And so to have something like this seemingly pop out of nowhere for a lot of disciplines, that especially in something like English or literature, arts, is very disorienting. So it is a lot of work to learn to work with that in your education.
Yeah, I mean, I think one way to think about it is that AI and large language models are not going to make our jobs easier. I don't think, in terms of and what we actually do. I don't mean easier in the sense of how it makes it harder for us because students are using it and how we get in our curriculum, but just there will be a lot of tools coming out in the next 6 months that will help grade papers, will help provide feedback, that will do that kind of work. But what it's going to end up making us is, first of all, we'll be able to provide the level of feedback to students when we have large classes that we couldn't do before, but it'll free us up to actually, potentially work with students that need more help, be able to give that, and I don't know what this is yet, but some way of giving feedback that makes all the AI feedback make sense. If that works.
Yeah, kind of contextualizing it, kind of.
Yeah, one thing I've been doing is much more audio feedback on top of the written feedback that goes with it, because I find in that I can coalesce and explain it. So if I had an AI product that could produce feedback on learner work in terms of text, then I could, in a quick recording of 30 seconds, make that make sense, contextualize it, make it so that the student can follow along with it.
And actually, somebody in the chat, exact same thing, said I've been using dialogic feedback for a while now. My own questions instead of statements of what they did or did not do. And this has helped my ESL students understand how language works. And that's a really, really cool aspect that I had not even considered.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. And maybe what AI will do will make that scalable. That'll make it, we are able to do it to a larger extent, maybe larger classes, or, in even more detail. I think that's fantastic. And
that's a really cool thing that I've seen popping up. Obviously, on LinkedIn, everything's flooded with different AI applications. And one of the big ones right now is for DEI uses. So for diversity, equity, inclusion, and using AI tools and applications to expand the accessibility of higher education, which is, I think, a really awesome, not necessarily side effect, because it very well could have been the intended purpose, but yeah, it's interesting to be kind of living through it. It feels like, I mean, I can't imagine, but when the internet came out, like, it's such a powerful new thing, and learning how to live with that is a really, I think, unique experience.
Yeah, I agree. I just see a comment: online exams are no longer possible. I totally agree right now. And that goes to the whole, what I was saying earlier, but we have a cohort that's at risk, but there will be tools that go into limiting and focusing in computer student, preventing them from accessing things. Although, and I guess unless they had two computers, but what excites me a lot is that there's going to be such a change in the tools that we have to be teachers, and how what we can actually do with them, and how do we solve problems like having an exam that, an online exam the way we used to. Yeah, and oral exams. I think oral exams, I've gone back and forth with that, because I think about accessibility and equity again, where some people are excellent at thinking on their feet and being able to verbalize exactly what they're doing, and other people are much better at being able to having that gap between their brain and their fingers in producing text and type. And it's an interesting thing.
I've even been using it for my own writing. Occasionally I'll get stuck on a word, or I can't figure out how to phrase something. So I'll feed it into ChatGPT, and while I don't copy the answers, it kind of gives me, it's like a crutch, like it helps me in the right direction, gives me the ideas of where I need my brain to go.
Yeah, I agree.
Oh, this is
yeah, it's definitely not the same as calculators. I totally agree.
Oh yeah.
I was more comparing it in the effect.
It's
But that's a great point.
Yeah, it's very I guess the difference between a calculator and a generative pre-trained transformer is the difference between an abacus and a calculator.
Yeah.
This is a really interesting one. Is GPT any version at a point to be prompted to produce the detailed prompt that would allow it to write a more comprehensive paper? So could you ask ChatGPT to write the prompt that would produce a better paper?
I'd never thought of that.
I had never even considered that.
I think that would be a really interesting experiment. And if someone built an interface that took the prompt that was created and then fed that prompt back in, and I guess you could do it manually.
That's our
But I don't know.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm thinking about that question though, and I don't know if that would. Anyway, I'm going to think about that some more. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, if we have time at the end, I'll pull up ChatGPT and we can ask it to write a prompt. That was one of the things that our previous speaker spoke about, was prompt engineering, and how that's kind of a new role and a new thing that exists, is people whose job is to write the best prompt to get the best output. I think that's a very curious, it's almost like getting it stuck in a boot loop. It's writing the prompts to make better content. Yeah, that's very interesting. Do you know of any academic programs or AI certificates that students might be able to take to show AI competence on a resume?
I haven't seen any that I've seen lots of AI certificates. I mean, there's a ton of boot camps out there and online Coursera courses, and obviously if you go into computer science, any of the post-secondary institutions, that's great. But I think that there will be micro credentials that are created for people to develop an understanding of be able to have credentials that show they understand what large language models are and how to work with them and everything. And I think they're going to become very specific to different industries and different use cases. I don't know that there's one I would promote right now, because I haven't seen any. Everything's so new, and everybody here that works in post-secondary education, to get a new course, it's not going to happen in a month and a half, maybe a year and a half. So I think a lot of the more agile schools that can get these micro credentials out, they'll be there to take.
Yeah, that was somebody, I was listening to a podcast the other day, and they had discussed licensing. So having to, sign a form or fill out a thing that gives you access to a large language model, saying that, yes, I understand, the information could be biased. It could, it's a very, like you said, it's so new that, we're looking for answers that the people who are supposed to have those answers aren't even sure of just yet, and we're kind of figuring it out as a society together.
Mm-hmm.
A really, really great note here from Sylvie. Let's remember that we once objected to calculators and didn't allow them in exams, but we learned that there were other important skills to learn. Case studies went through this problem, students having to answer online existing cases. We continually need to pivot and focus on new needed skills and away from older methods. Not a bad thing. Awesome. I think that students that do not use AI are disadvantaged. I think that is a really good point, and something that I've come across is AI is a very, very broad term. There's a lot of things that are AI but aren't large language models, and vice versa. Like autocorrect, spell check, I think was most of us use it daily. So it's kind of a thing that we all are going to have to learn how to live in a world with.
I totally agree. I think that there is a real accessibility issue with the AI and with large language models in particular. And I think that's why it's on us to bring them forward and, you know, make sure everybody's on a level playing field as far as using them. And that's why just banning them will just cause more problems.
I'll sneak in and bully my way in to ask my own question. Is something like that, so access to large language models, so something like OpenAI, where it is an open API, do you think that we'll see more closed systems coming out? People finding a way to monetize it or gatekeep that technology?
Define what you mean by the technology.
Sorry. So something, I'll use OpenAI, ChatGPT specifically as an example. So if they were to say, okay, it's not free for everyone to use anymore, you have to pay $10 a month, while using freely available information. So I'm wondering, I guess, is there even a way to patent that? To patent the, I guess, GPT-3? Do you think that we'll see kind of a more monetized approach to it?
Yeah, I think OpenAI's model wouldn't be charging $10 to use it as much as charging API fees to companies that are going to build that thin layer of innovation on top of the large language model. And there's going to be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of those kind of really specialized applications. So like for example, you know, something like JSTOR or one of the journal publishers, Taylor Francis or whatever, there'll be companies that will provide the ability for them to turn their articles into a knowledge base for a large language model so that, you know, you could ask questions of a paper or whichever. So I don't think the monetization is going to be on the level of the large language model itself. And there are too many open source large language models that are still relatively powerful. You know, they're not as powerful as GPT-4 right now, but they're powerful enough to still produce good stuff.
It was very interesting because the first session in the series that we had was the day after GPT-4 became publicly available. So it was interesting because, like, even some of the slides that we had, I was like, well, this isn't relevant anymore because yes, now it can do this thing. The biggest change that I noticed was on OpenAI's website, they kind of score the model on different assessments. So like university level calculus, it's written the LSATs, and the difference between even GPT 3.5 and GPT-4 was insane. And that happened in less than a year.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Online exam is still in force with online proctoring. Paper and pencil, old school. I think that's totally doable in a lot of disciplines, but I'm interested, and I guess this is a good question for you because you're familiar with it. So things like programming or computer science, where doing, you know, nobody's going to be writing out their coding thesis long form in a blue book. How do you see disciplines that require technology to be used for assessment adapting?
Can you clarify that? I mean, you're talking about teaching coding?
Sorry, so in a discipline like computer science, where you really can't go back to in-person handwritten paper pencil exams, Is there anything that you've come across, either colleagues or research, that has indicated where assessment's heading with those? Or if anybody in the chat is in one of those disciplines and has found ways to do it?
Well, computer science is facing the same problem as us, because code lines can be written by GPT-4, but so they're working again on process again. How do you, and there was a comment before about it being this kind of, if we focus too much on process, it becomes kind of a circular kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree. I think that is one of the problems and challenges we have to try to figure out. How do we rework potentially the process from what it is now? Maybe the exact same process, and just focusing on analyzing it through the process is not the answer. We have to develop a new way of looking at how we teach process-wise. A lot of processes in some instances.
Awesome. Oh, this is a good one. Are there examples of data on the internet being poisoned so GPT would present spurious content? So I guess, can you influence ChatGPT with poisoned data, I guess?
I mean, to think about poison data, the same way that I said you could create knowledge bases for truth, you could create knowledge bases for lies. And this is what Jeffrey Hinton was saying the other day, is that it's going to be really difficult to know what's true anymore, and looking at certain sources on the internet, because there'll be, people could just, conspiracy theory people or whatever could easily create knowledge bases in the same way, a textbook company creates knowledge bases.
Yep.
And it would be the same problem. So it is one of the biggest problems I think we're going to face. And it's going to come down to, right now we look at websites to try and determine whether or not we trust it. We trust McGraw-Hill, for delivering the right content. Maybe we don't trust Joe's textbooks or something. And it's going to end up being the same kind of a thing. But there's going to be lots of really real and realistic and properties that are created that look truthful.
I was trying to write a bio to introduce myself for the speech. So I asked ChatGPT, I fed it my LinkedIn profile, and it wrote a very, very convincing backstory for me that absolutely never happened. It sounded entirely plausible, and if you didn't know me, it would fit. But yeah, that is a really interesting kind of who decides what is good learning material or not.
Yeah, and it's the nuance, because I did the same thing where I wanted to create my bio or whatever, and it called me an expert in AI, and I'm not an expert in AI. Like
I called you that too, so I lied.
I'm not. I can't code a transformer neural network. I can look at code, I can understand, but I'm not, and I'm much more on the application side, and on the education and theory side, and on the ethical side. So it's, but it sounds good, an expert in AI, it comes out, but it's that kind of thing. And it's the kind of mistake that nobody would notice, necessarily. Yep.
Yeah, like something, I noticed there was one that it spit out, and it was a date and of like a historic event, and it got the year wrong. And I was like that would make sense. It was only off by a year, but I would never fact check that. It's the right time period. So I think that does kind of go into the assessment, where having students go in and say, okay, verify it, trust it, but verify it. I think the AI tool capability appears to be overhyped from my observation. So I guess that is more of a social question. Do you think that it's either overhyped, or are people underestimating it in your experience?
A while back, I got a call from a CNBC editor to go and speak about it. And the reason she wanted me to do it is she thought I would be kind of someone who would come back and put down some of the hype that has come out of there. And I could have, and I gave up a chance to be on TV by saying, I can't do it. The large language models are as hyped as they have been. I mean, the hype that they're experiencing right now is justified. I can't think of, right now a student can produce an essay that, that would be passable and you would not know that they didn't write it necessarily if they made sure it didn't sound too good. If they said write it at a, if they told GPT-4 to write it at a certain level of understanding, they knew how to do the prompts, it would produce it, and it's next to impossible to prove that they didn't do it. I mean, there's companies trying to create technologies to try and capture it. And early on, it was easy to tell because there were no mistakes. You had an essay that was pretty much perfect, but you can make it write it at the level that would pass. You could prompt it to make the odd grammar mistakes. You could edit something to make its own grammar mistakes. And I think there's so many jobs that writing is involved in that large language models are going to become a big part of. I mean, I think law is going to be one that, the AI, the lawyer that knows how to work AI will be a much better lawyer. I was reading a paper a while back where they were talking about chess. And before Garry Kasparov lost to Big Blue, they said the top 10 chess players in the world would not stand a chance against even the top 25, 30 chess players today because of the ability to use training against AI constantly. They became much, much better chess players. So people, lawyers, screenwriters, everybody else are just gonna end up becoming better screenwriters, better lawyers with the tool. And maybe it's not so much better, but maybe the expectation of what they're capable of is going to increase.
I was reading a story, popped up somewhere on social media, but it was a gentleman in the US who just used, I can't recall the name of it, but it's an AI lawyer service that you pay a fee to, and it's like ChatGPT, but for legal questions. And he used it to represent himself in a court case and won. And like you said, there's a certain standard, I think, that's going to change of what people expect from different professions and different disciplines.
I want to just say that there's a comment in there that Dr. Martin Luther King, the function of education to teach one to think intensively and to think critically, intelligence plus character. That's the true goal of education. How does AI best fit in there? I think that's one of the best articulations of what our problem is and what we have to try to figure out. I think if we could, if there was some way to say that large language models weren't developed, at least in the field of education, and it didn't enter it, it would probably be better in the short term, at least. But I don't think we have that option. I think we have to figure out how do we make it part of that goal of education? How do we somehow bring, maybe ethics has to become much more front and center in terms of teaching communication and teaching writing and teaching expression, and ethics becomes something that, and I don't have the answer to this. I know I get to do the webinar, but this is a massive question that it worries me so much because of and I've said this 3 times now, but there's a cohort that's at risk right now because we haven't figured out how to deal with this effectively yet, but we will.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a good one here. What level of coding and AI ability do you see people needing in the future? For academics, do you think just knowing the technology will be enough? So I guess it's an anonymous attendee, so I can't do a follow-up question, but I guess I'd be interested actually in hearing the answer to that from a student as well as instructor perspective. Is how good do we all need to be with AI?
I think the way we have, if you'd asked me just 5 years ago, I would have, the coding thing would have been really important. I would have said learning some coding, at least understanding what coding is and all that sort of thing. I think that's becoming less and less in the same way, because in the same way that, expression through words is becoming automated, coding is becoming automated. But I think you can do really well in the world by just understanding what AI does. The questions that we've been throwing out in this chat and in the Q&A, they're the same questions that, that if they figure that out, that is what the level of AI that you have to do. Understanding how a transformer neural network actually works, understanding weights and, the way that layers, the hidden layer and all that kind of stuff. I don't know that that's that important. I think what's more important is how do you actually put it into practice to try to make something more effective. And You know, it's the same way, I guess, with a lot of technologies. I mean, you don't need to know how a computer works inside, but you can do some amazing things.
And that's kind of an interesting thing that has come up, is that people who otherwise are not familiar with AI or have never worked with AI in their discipline before are now having to deal with it on a daily basis, despite, you know, not having the background that a programmer or a developer would have. So it's the, I guess, accessibility now. Everybody can go online, talk to ChatGPT. AI is at your fingertips. So it's a more real thing than a science fiction villain now.
Yeah, it'll become part of most things in some way.
Awesome. Oh, the gentleman who just asked a question said he has to run. He has another meeting. Good info, but I really am interested in the answer to his question. We are studying how to identify AI written products. There are indicators. Question: should we publish these indicators because as AI evolves, these indicators will change?
Well, I believe you should always publish information because other people are going to take it and think of new ways to work with it, and it'll cascade the thinking that goes along with that. But you're right. I mean, that's the biggest. Even OpenAI itself has difficulty figuring out how to write applications that detect improper information. I mean, their way is very shotgun like, you know, where they basically identify a number of different topics, subjects, everything else like that, and it's hard code in answers that can't talk about that and that sort of thing. So it's, but as OpenAI starts becoming the foundation of all kinds of other companies and organizations and entities, good or bad, it's going to be a challenge.
This is a really good note from Eileen. The FINK's Significant Learning Objectives Framework, specifically the Learning How to Learn and Assessment for Learning theory, might help instructors. It's in the doing that students are learning, and the evidence of their learning is in their reflection. The instructor would only need to spot check to help students develop a better reflective practice.
I agree. I think that's a great comment.
Yeah. I'm gonna have to pull the transcript after to read through to make sure I haven't missed any, because there's fantastic discussion happening in here.
Me too.
And I think we are almost at time. I could absolutely sit here all day and do this. This one from Hannah is really interesting. She notes that she is encouraging her students to work in groups and teams, creating contracts for how they will work together, how they will use the technology, and what they will represent as their own and what they will identify as automated expression. Yeah,
I think that's great. I think that goes to the whole idea of bringing character. You know, I forget who had the comment on Martin Luther King's take on education. I think that's a great step towards that.
Yeah, that it's really encouraging to see all of the great ideas that people are having about how they're going to adapt to this. Well, oh, here we go. Well, I hate cutting it short. I could sit here until 8 p.m. and ask questions all day because I have lots, but thank you so much, everybody, for attending. Dr. Clapperton, for speaking. This was phenomenal. Next time we'll do longer than an hour. And yeah, we hope to see everybody at future sessions. If you've registered once for the series, you don't actually have to register again. You'll continue to get details on upcoming sessions. Yeah, and don't forget to follow us on social media. Go check out Ametros Learning if you want to see a bit more behind what Dr. Clapperton has done. And yeah, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
It was great.
Awesome. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.